Somewhere beneath the frigid waters of the North Atlantic, a Russian submarine is moving. And NATO may not hear it. That's not a hypothetical scenario from a Cold War thriller. It's the operational reality taking shape right now, as Russia's newest diesel-electric submarines begin slipping through one of the most strategically critical choke points on Earth, the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap. And the technology making this possible represents a direct challenge to detection systems the West has relied on for decades. The GIUK gap has long been considered NATO's underwater tripwire, stretching across roughly 1,500 miles of open ocean between Greenland, Iceland, and the northern tip of the United Kingdom. This corridor is the primary route any Russian submarine must traverse to reach the open Atlantic from its northern fleet bases on the Kola Peninsula. During the Cold War, the United States and its allies invested billions into a sprawling network of underwater listening stations, sonar arrays, and patrol aircraft, specifically designed to catch Soviet submarines as they tried to push through this bottleneck. For a time, it worked remarkably well. Soviet submarines were loud, relatively speaking, and Western hydrophones could pick them up at considerable distances. But that era is over. Russia's Project 677 Lada-class submarines represent a fundamentally different kind of challenge. These aren't nuclear-powered behemoths generating constant reactor noise. They're compact, diesel-electric boats designed from the ground up for one thing above all else: silence. And after years of developmental setbacks that led many Western analysts to write the program off entirely, Russia has quietly brought the Lada-class back from the dead. The commissioning of the Kronstadt in January 2024 and the Velikiye Luki in December 2025 signals that Moscow has stabilized its production pipeline, and the implications for NATO's anti-submarine warfare posture are serious. To understand why the Lada-class matters so much, you have to understand the program's troubled history. The prototype vessel, the Sankt Peterburg, was laid down in December 1997 and didn't enter service until May 2010. Already a 13-year construction timeline that raised red flags. Once operational, the Sankt Peterburg was plagued by chronic technical issues. The problems were severe enough that Russia decommissioned the boat in February 2024, less than 14 years after it first raised its flag. For a long time, Western defense planners assumed the entire Lada program might collapse under the weight of its own dysfunction. That assumption turned out to be dangerously premature. The first serial production Lada, the Kronstadt, was laid down in July 2005, but didn't commission until January 2024, a staggering 19 years from keel laying to operational status. That timeline alone tells you how much difficulty Russia encountered. But the critical point is that Russia didn't abandon the program. It absorbed the lessons from the Sankt Peterburg's failures, iterated on the design, and eventually delivered a functional, combat-ready submarine. The Kronstadt was assigned to the Northern Fleet, placing it in the exact position to access the GIUK gap. Then came the Velikiye Luki, which raised its flag on December 16, 2025, and was assigned to the Baltic Fleet, instantly doubling Russian submarine presence in that theater from one vessel to two. At least two more hulls, the Vologda and the Yaroslavl, are currently under construction, with estimated delivery dates in the 2025 to 2026 window. Russia has plans for as many as 9 Lada-class boats in total. But the number of hulls is only part of a story. What makes the Lada-class genuinely alarming from a Western perspective is what's on the outside of the hull, and potentially what's coming next on the inside. We'll get to the inside part shortly, because that's where things get really concerning. The Lada-class features an advanced anti-acoustic coating applied to the submarine's exterior. This is an ordinary anechoic tiling of the kind that's been used on submarines for decades. According to detailed analysis of the system, this new coating serves a dual purpose. It suppresses noise generated internally by the submarine's own machinery, and it absorbs incoming sonar pulses from active sonar systems, reducing the strength of the return echo. In practical terms, a Lada-class submarine is harder to detect, both passively, by listening for the sounds it makes, and actively, by bouncing sonar waves off its hull. That dual-spectrum stealth capability directly challenges the detection ranges of the sonobuoys, towed arrays, and fixed seabed sensors that NATO has relied on to monitor the GIUK gap and the broader North Atlantic for generations. If you're following this and starting to rethink assumptions about Western submarine detection, drop your perspective in the comments, because this is one of those topics where the conventional wisdom may be seriously outdated. Now about what might be coming on the inside. Russia initially planned to equip the Lada-class with Air-Independent Propulsion, commonly known as AIP. Conventional diesel-electric submarines have a critical limitation. They must periodically surface or raise a snorkel mast to run their diesel engines and recharge their batteries. During this time, they're vulnerable to detection by radar, visual observation, and electronic surveillance. AIP systems eliminate or drastically reduce this requirement by allowing a submarine to generate electricity while fully submerged, using technologies like fuel cells or closed-cycle engines. Russia dropped its AIP plans for the Lada in 2019, which many analysts interpreted as a sign that the technology was beyond Moscow's reach. But reports from 2022 indicate that Russian engineers resumed work on an electrochemical hydrogen generator designed for submarine use, with a completion target in the mid-2020s. If that effort succeeds, future Lada-class submarines could remain submerged for weeks at a time without surfacing, transforming them from a regional stealth threat into something far more strategically potent. A submarine you can't hear and that never needs to come up for air is, by any reasonable measure, a nightmare for anti-submarine warfare planners. So what is NATO doing about all of this? The Western response has centered on several pillars, some well-established and some still emerging. The most visible and arguably most capable asset is the Boeing P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft. The Royal Air Force declared full operating capability for its fleet of 9 Poseidon MRA-1 aircraft at RAF Lossiemouth in Scotland in January 2024. These aircraft are purpose-built for anti-submarine warfare, capable of flying long-endurance missions over the GIUK gap, the Norwegian Sea, and the open Atlantic, deploying patterns of sonobuoys that listen for submarine signatures and processing the acoustic data in real time. The P-8A represents a significant upgrade over the aging patrol aircraft it replaced, and its sensor suite is genuinely formidable. Regional cooperation is also deepening. The UK and Norway have prioritized joint ASW patrols, recognizing that their geographic positions flanking the GIUK gap make them natural partners. Denmark, which controls Greenland, the western anchor of the gap, has invested in new maritime patrol aircraft to strengthen coverage in that critical sector. These partnerships are expanding the overall surveillance footprint, but they're also highlighting a fundamental problem of scale. Defense commentators have pointed out that 9 P-8A aircraft, the RAF's current total, may not be enough to sustain the kind of continuous around-the-clock coverage that a genuine barrier patrol requires. The math is unforgiving. Accounting for maintenance cycles, crew availability, transit times, and the sheer geographic expanse of the patrol area, estimates suggest that 12 or more aircraft would be needed to maintain what one analyst described as a credible line in the sand. 9 aircraft can provide robust coverage during surge operations, but sustained 24/7 monitoring is a different proposition entirely. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time, because the strategic picture only gets more complex from here. Beyond airborne assets, NATO has historically relied on the Integrated Undersea Surveillance System, known as IUSS, a network of fixed hydrophone arrays positioned on the ocean floor at key choke points. During the Cold War, IUSS was devastatingly effective, providing continuous passive monitoring of submarine movements across the Atlantic. The system still operates today, but it faces two growing problems. First, the advanced acoustic coatings on submarines like the Lada-class are specifically designed to reduce detection by exactly these kinds of passive listening systems. Second, and perhaps more troubling, fixed seabed infrastructure is increasingly viewed as vulnerable to deliberate sabotage. The recent history of undersea cable damage and pipeline sabotage in European waters has underscored just how exposed static underwater installations can be. A fixed array that gets severed or disabled could create a blind spot in NATO's detection net at precisely the wrong moment. On the surface, the Royal Navy contributes Type 23 frigates, equipped with the Type 2087 towed array sonar, one of the most capable ship-mounted ASW sensor systems in any Western Navy. These frigates can deploy their towed arrays behind the ship, listening for submarine contacts at ranges that significantly exceed those of hull-mounted sonar. The challenge isn't capability, it's availability. The Royal Navy's fleet of high-end ASW frigates is limited, and these ships are in constant demand for a wide range of missions beyond submarine hunting. Relying on a small number of surface combatants to cover an entire ocean is not a sustainable strategy. This is where the Atlantic Bastion concept enters the picture, and it may represent the most ambitious rethinking of NATO's anti-submarine warfare approach since the height of the Cold War. Developed by British strategic thinkers and endorsed at senior levels within the Royal Navy, the Atlantic Bastion envisions a layered defensive network that integrates crewed platforms like the P-8A and Type 23 frigates with a new generation of uncrewed and autonomous systems. The concept operates across three distinct tiers. The outermost tier, positioned in areas like the Western Barents Sea, would consist of distributed low-mobility sensors designed to provide early warning of Russian submarine departures and constrain their freedom of action before they even reach the GIUK gap. The middle tier would deploy uncrewed underwater vehicles and ocean gliders to trail Russian submarines deep into the Atlantic, maintaining contact without risking expensive crewed warships. The innermost tier would position assets with maritime deep strike capabilities to protect the surveillance network itself from interference or destruction. A central component of the Atlantic Bastion is the Royal Navy's Project CABOT, which aims to establish an ASW barrier across the North Atlantic, built primarily on autonomous platforms. One of the most intriguing elements of CABOT is the potential deployment of AI-enabled underwater gliders, specifically the SG-1 Fathom, equipped with an acoustic processing system called LoRa. These gliders are slow-moving, long-endurance autonomous vehicles that can drift through the ocean for weeks or months, passively listening for submarine signatures and transmitting detections back to command centers. Deployed in sufficient numbers across the GIUK gap, they could create a persistent, distributed acoustic net that doesn't depend on any single fixed installation and is far more difficult to neutralize than a cable sitting on the seabed. The promise of this approach is enormous, but there's a critical gap between concept and capability, and right now, that gap favors Russia. The autonomous systems at the heart of the Atlantic Bastion, the gliders, the UUVs, the AI-driven acoustic processing, are still in procurement and testing phases. They are not yet deployed at scale. Meanwhile, the Lada-class submarines are operational today. The Kronstadt is assigned to the Northern Fleet today. The Velikiye Luki is in the Baltic today. The timeline mismatch between the emerging threat and the emerging response is the central vulnerability in NATO's current posture. There's also a cautionary lesson embedded in the Lada program itself, one that NATO procurement officials would do well to study carefully. Russia spent nearly 2 decades turning the Lada from a dysfunctional prototype into a deployable weapon system. The Sankt Peterburg was a failure that had to be scrapped. The Kronstadt took 19 years to build. NATO must ensure that its own next-generation ASW systems don't follow a similar trajectory of delays and cost overruns. Platforms like the SG-1 Fathom glider need to be rigorously tested in the actual environmental conditions of the GIUK gap, the severe temperature gradients, the high ambient noise, the punishing weather, the complex acoustic propagation patterns unique to deep northern waters, before they're counted on as primary barrier components. Fielding an autonomous glider that performs well in a test facility but fails in a January North Atlantic storm would be worse than useless. It would create a false sense of security at a moment when clarity is paramount. If you know someone who follows naval strategy or the evolving power balance in the Atlantic, send this their way, because this story is only getting started. As of early 2026, the undersea competition in the North Atlantic is intensifying along a trajectory that currently favors the offense. Russia is projected to continue building Lada-class submarines, with as many as 9 holes planned across its fleets. If Moscow successfully integrates electrochemical AIP systems into future boats, that inside-the-hull development we flagged earlier, the Lada-class will achieve a level of submerged endurance that the current Western detection architecture simply isn't optimized to counter. A quiet submarine that surfaces rarely and absorbs sonar pulses is, in operational terms, approaching the stealth profile of a nuclear boat, but at a fraction of the cost, and without the telltale thermal and reactor signatures that make nuclear submarines detectable by other means. The West's counter-strategy is sound in theory. The Atlantic Bastion concept, if fully realized, would create exactly the kind of dynamic, resilient, layered detection network that the new threat environment demands. But the operative phrase is, if fully realized. The funding has to materialize. The technology has to mature. The autonomous platforms have to prove themselves in unforgiving operational conditions. And all of this has to happen faster than Russia's submarine production line can deliver new holes into the water. That is the race unfolding right now beneath the surface of the North Atlantic. What is clear is that the GIUK gap, that vast, cold stretch of open ocean that once served as NATO's reliable submarine tripwire, no longer functions the way it used to. The sensors are aging. The submarines are quieter. The threat is evolving faster than the response can keep pace. Whether the Atlantic Bastion can close that gap before it widens beyond recovery will be one of the defining strategic questions of this decade. And the answer will shape the balance of naval power in the Atlantic for a generation to come.